Okay. Just describe the kind of fits and starts of Carroll becoming a county.
There were several efforts to found a new county. There were folks in Carroll County, what would become Carroll County, that had thought you needed a new county seat in Uniontown. There was a movement, there was a newspaper called the Engine of Liberty published to format a new county. That happened in the War of 1812 period, but it was not until the 1830s that there were really strong efforts to found a new county. There were several votes in the legislature. One of my favorite stories, there was a vote down in my hometown of Manchester. The county folks in Baltimore County at that time didn't want to be part of a new county. There was a movement, portion of the people, and they drug a cannon up on the hill, Catholic Hill, actually where I grew up, and fired a victory shot at Westminster, which they thought was the reason that they wanted to have a new county. Shortly thereafter, in 1837, the county was formed, and I think most people felt that that was a good idea. You had half of Baltimore County, half of Frederick County coming together, and you have a new county, and there was great celebration in Westminster.
And I think even though the legislature was going to pass it, did they put it to the vote of the Carroll County, well, the people in that area?
Sure, it was done by popular vote. And as I say, in 36 there was a vote that did not pass the county, but it was re-looked at, and then it was passed, and the county was formed in 1837.
And what was some of the celebration? They have parades and...
I think the first one, it's January, and there was a bad snowstorm. So the celebration was somewhat subdued, but a celebration nonetheless of a new county. It's an exciting thing. Named for Charles Carroll, the last signer of the Declaration of Independence, a Marylander. And that was part of their celebration, honoring Charles Carroll.
And did the other towns celebrate too, or did everybody kind of come to Westminster as the county seat?
I think Westminster became the focus. Obviously, people not traveling maybe had local celebrations, more subdued perhaps, but Westminster was the focus at that point.
Okay. Just kind of stepping back then, just talk a little bit about the early immigrants, who they were, where they came from, and why they stayed.
Well, I think most of your immigrants, or emigrants in that case, those who were already here, were coming for opportunity, as most people had come to the New World. You're looking in the 1730s, 1740s, people started to move into this area. Pennsylvania Germans coming south and Tidewater English coming north. We always think of migration being from east to west, but in this area it's north to south, south to north. So those two cultural groups, Pennsylvania Germans bringing their ways, coming into the northern half of what will become Carroll County, and then Tidewater English coming up out of the Annapolis, Anne Arundel County area, bringing their ways. And their impacts on the counties are quite different. In the northern half of the county, you have towns being created, small farms as Germans were used to. And in the south, you have larger plantations, the idea of building a larger farm. And you don't have the growth of towns until much later.
The African Americans, just in a sense, did they come with the, were there some already here that were free, or did they come with the Tidewater English as slaves? Okay.
African American history obviously begins when the Tidewater English come. The use of slaves in their culture, an agrarian culture, large farms, they did bring slavery to Carroll County. Pennsylvania Germans owned slaves to a much lesser degree. One of the reasons they had left Germany was because of oppression, and it was felt that owning slavery was not consistent with their culture, although some Pennsylvania Germans did. It's interesting, some of those who were here early who had done well in this economy manumitted their slaves, freed their slaves when they passed on in the 1820s, 1830s, adding to that free black population. The Quakers also set their slaves free. Methodism formed in Carroll County also did not believe in holding slaves. So as early as the first census in 1790, you had nearly equal slave and free black populations in what will become Carroll County. And those populations stayed nearly equal up until the Civil War. The Tidewater English favored a large plantation lifestyle. 400, 500 acre farms were not uncommon for them. Very labor intensive. They were growing tobacco, and those crops were then exported down to Annapolis and shipped out. And that economy used slavery, and those large farms were their ideal. Not having a community center like you would have in the German populations. You'd have towns like Taneytown, Uniontown, Manchester, Hampstead. These were town centers. And while you had agriculture, they were smaller subsistence operations, maybe 150 acres, 200 acres is what they were looking at. A very different contrast with the plantations in the southern part of the county. Those small farm operations generated a lot of grain crops, and there was adequate water power throughout Carroll County, so you have mills dotting the landscape, hundreds of mills in the history of Carroll County. Water power that was very reliable during most of the year, although there were times when the water was low, the mill would sit idle, but throughout most of the year those mills operated, grinding grain. There were also textile operations throughout the county, weaving cloth, and again used in the local economy or sometimes exported to Baltimore and Annapolis, and raising funds for those farmers who were in those operations. You had good road systems in Carroll County. There were many Indian paths, and they obviously found the easiest way through the region. And Carroll County did not have large settlements of Native Americans, but it used these roads to travel through, hunting game, traveling from different parts throughout their life cycles in a year. And those roads became the pathways of immigration, the pathways of commerce throughout the county. The typical Pennsylvania German community is at a crossroads of transportation, again, of commerce and industry. You would have the tradesmen, the blacksmith, the tanners, the local church would be there, either Reformed or the Lutheran church, and many times they were a union church where congregations would share a building. And then you had the small merchants, the tavern, and those folks would be congregated along a small main street. And then around the community would be those small German farms that would bring their produce or would come to market in the small town. Obviously, the settlement period is sort of, I like to call it kind of almost the Wild West, where you had a town founder, pure development, there's no rules and regulations. A man would buy a piece of real estate and lay it out into lots, and then would sell those lots. And obviously had an idea of where public buildings would be, may give land to say where the local church would be built, to encourage the sale of those lots. And those town founders, there were several of them throughout Carroll County, did very well, established a town, and they also sold what they called a ground rent. So a rent would be paid, so they would encourage someone to buy a lot, build a home in a certain number of years, and then pay a ground rent. It was almost an income that they could rely on for sometimes up to 100 years. Westminster is a good example of how a town was laid out. William Winchester buys several pieces of land here, White's Level, Timber Ridge, several other tracts of land, and lays out lots in the 1760s, encourages people to buy those lots. The Historical Society is at the east end of town. We think of Westminster being down the center by the railroad tracks in the center of town now, but where the Historical Society is at 210 East Main Street, that's the end of Westminster, and it goes in the other direction. So towns, as they evolved over a period of time with commerce and changes in transportation, road system, particularly the railroad coming to Westminster, the center of town actually moves west. Well, certainly the coming of the railroad is a great American invention. Transportation always was key to town developments, and if the railroad passed you by, as it did in some Carroll County towns, those towns did not grow. Westminster, obviously being a county seat, was always going to be a center of commerce, government, industry, and so forth. So the railroad coming here in the 1860s made it, cemented that position for transportation and commerce. In some ways it moved the center of town west because the railroad has to follow the topography. With the coming of the railroad, you have greater ability to transport goods, both agricultural product but also implements down to Baltimore. The canning industry develops in Carroll County, very strong because of that strong agricultural land here. You have the Shriver Canning Company that's in business right after the Civil War, connected with Baltimore. You have a couple implement companies in Carroll County that are serving the needs of farmers as implements are developed. You have the Taylor Manufacturing Company in Westminster building agricultural implements. Those could be shipped throughout the county either by railroad or exported down to Baltimore and sent to other agricultural areas. In Union Mills, you have the Shriver family setting up very early in the 1790s a complex with a mill building, also tannery, and you have a very small community there growing up around that to supply the labor and to supply the raw materials for that operation. I think very successfully. They were good businessmen, they had an excellent location, and they worked very hard to build that small industry there. Well, transportation is always an important theme in looking at the county history. In the beginning, you have pathways used by Native Americans growing into roads, wagon, and horse transportation, the coming of the railroad at the time of the Civil War, and then the coming of the automobile in the 20th century changes transportation. The railroad made it easy to go to work in Baltimore. People would commute. You had train running constantly from Westminster and the other towns down to Baltimore. But by the 1950s, the automobile eclipsed railroad transportation, and also the coming of the truck transportation and automobile transportation largely replacing a lot of the rail transportation, at least for passengers. And by the 1960s, that rail transportation is largely gone in Carroll County. There's been a resurgence in the last 20 years of moving freight. Some of that freight never stopped, but the passenger is gone, again, yielding to the automobile, the great American invention, the great equalizer. Everyone has an automobile and relying on that. But I think public transportation ebbs and flows, and we may be seeing a greater reliance on public transportation as we enter the next few years in Carroll County. Worm seed was one of the unique Carroll County products. It was a very difficult plant to grow, but Carroll County had the ideal soils and climate for that. So in the 19th and early 20th centuries, worm seed production was nearly unique to Carroll County. It was a product that was used in vermifuge, a medicine for livestock animals. And some of the older fellows who used to talk about it would take those products to New York, a very valuable product. It was shipped there. But in the mid-20th century, there were other products that replaced that. So it's no longer grown here, but it's one of those unique Carroll County stories. In the Taylorsville area was sort of the epicenter for growing that unique product in the 20th century. Well, during the 19th century, newspaper publishing was done on a much more local level than we see today. You had newspapers in almost all of the towns in Carroll County, and those did survive into the late 20th century. The newspapers were quite partisan in the 19th century. The editors were a voice of the community, and also for partisan politics. The early papers in Carroll County, the Engine of Liberty in Uniontown, was promoting the production of the creation of a Carroll County. And those newspaper editors throughout the Civil War, very vocal. You had an editor in Westminster who lost his life over his editorial, had mentioned right before Lincoln was assassinated, perhaps it was better if Lincoln hadn't survived the war. And when he was assassinated, he was run out of town and told not to come back. If he did, he'd be killed. And he came back and he was killed. So newspapers are a very big part of the communities. They were mostly weeklies, 4 pages long, and those did survive. Some do become weekly, some to be absorbed by other papers, and into the late 20th century. Springfield Hospital was built on the estate of Governor Brown, the only governor from Carroll County, and his estate became a state hospital, an important part of the economy of the southern part of Carroll County. The rich agricultural economy in Carroll County naturally led to the creation of state fairs or county fairs that were greatly participated in by local residents. I think in the late 1860s you had your first fair in Carroll County, and it was a typical fair where you would bring the agricultural products, the domestic products to be judged. There were prizes awarded. As early, I think that President Grant was one of the first presidents to visit Carroll County and came to the agricultural fair here in Westminster. There's documentation of him staying in the local newspaper editor's house and visiting with local people. One of the notable events in Carroll County history that had an effect on national history was the creation of rural free delivery. Edwin Shriver was a pioneer in rural free delivery, and that started in Carroll County in 1899. And Edwin was asked to go around the country and help start other rural free deliveries throughout the United States. During World War I, there was broad public support for the conflict. Everyone knew someone who was in uniform. We had almost 2,000 people from Carroll County in uniform. And you had a state organization called the Council of Defense, and in Carroll County you had a local chapter of the Council of Defense which coordinated all the civilian war work. The council worked with organizations such as the Red Cross. That's a good example of local support. They had knitting groups that would knit things for the soldiers, prepare things that the Army and Navy couldn't provide for them. They knitted wristlets, they knitted helmets, they knitted scarves, they knitted sweaters, and those things were produced, have a little tag on them, would have from the chapter in the Red Cross. They would be sent overseas or to stateside camps to supplement the soldiers' uniform equipage. And almost everyone was involved in local war work, either working for a Red Cross. They also collected peach pits, something we don't think about today as being as a war material. But peach pits were used to make the charcoal that was the ingredient to put in gas masks to protect soldiers' lives. Gas was one of the horrible weapons created during the First War, thankfully not used much after that. And the gas mask was a critical thing. I remember reading in the local papers that they would put red, white, and blue barrels outside of stores in Carroll County, and you were asked to deposit your peach pits. They would be collected up and then burned to make the charcoal, and then that would be sent in those soldiers' gas masks overseas. There was an incident in one of the small towns where the boys tipped over the peach pit barrel and were chastised in the local newspaper editor for interfering with the war effort. A local prank, but a very serious subject, and people took it very seriously to support those soldiers because, again, everyone had a neighbor who was there, or son, or daughter. In 1937, Carroll County celebrated the centennial. It was a big event in Carroll County. There were lots of public programs, there were parades. There was a huge parade in Westminster with floats from all over the county celebrating the county heritage and then the unique place names in Carroll County. That was a very important thing to the people to recognize that 100-year anniversary. Well, the Great Depression certainly hit people hard in Carroll County. Those in the manufacturing industry suffered because of the lack of demand for manufactured products. But Carroll County's strong agricultural economy did make it possible for many people to survive with less impact than they did in, say, in an urban area where more people were out of work. Certainly the small farms were not selling a lot of their produce, but certainly they were able to survive. The subsistence farms that we had seen here for 150, 200 years did continue, and there was less impact. And then the coming of World War II, the great industry, the great buildup at that time period brought us out of the Depression. You know, I don't have the statistics, but I seem to remember that it was only, I was working here at the Historical Society in the 90s when agriculture was finally eclipsed by other parts of the economy. So agriculture had stayed from the beginning years all the way into the mid-1990s as the driver in Carroll's economy. I think when I think of the 1950s, you think of the automobile, the popularization of leisure time and driving, and roads being built like the Westminster Bypass, which opened in 1954, which took industry and commerce off the main street of Westminster, relieved that traffic and put it out on a bypass. Governor McKeldin, when he opened the highway, spoke about how this would be an engine of development. We think of it today as, why do we build all those businesses out there? But in 1954, they were looking at that as to build new businesses, and now we look at a different need, a new bypass to come around Westminster. So the automobile, the truck, all those traffics, those economy drivers, you see growing in the 1950s, and industry building, population growing, and I think that changes the economic base in Carroll County so that by the mid-1990s it's no longer purely agricultural, though it still remains strong in parts of Carroll County. I think Westminster's fate, if you will, was inevitable. Being the county seat starting in 1837, it was going to become economic, governmental, commercial center of Carroll County. That would just be natural because of this being the county seat. The original farms that surrounded Carroll County have given way to development, which started immediately after the town was laid out, as it was attracting people to this center. The growth of the county after the 1830s and throughout the 19th century was a natural progression of people coming here for that center of commerce and government. I think Carroll County is still a great place to live. You have the heritage of Carroll County stretching back several hundred years, the imprint on the county from those early settlers and those later residents who've come to call Carroll County home. Everyone's made a contribution to our heritage, and for me it's still a great place to live.